For those of you who don't know me, I will say just a little bit about myself. I started my career as a programmer. And if you can guess my favorite language, you'll have a good idea about when I started my career as a programmer. And, I've done a lot of things over the years. I mean, I did testing. I was a manager. I was an internal consultant. I've been a business owner. I worked in a bookstore. So I've done a bunch of different things. And in all of those, I've been really interested in change. And so when we talk about silos, I think we can talk about where they come from and what we might be able to do to make them a little different. So to paraphrase medieval scholar Chris Wickham, organizations are not teleological. That's a fancy word, but it means that development does not go to, it goes from. So why am I starting a talk at an Agile conference with a quote from a scholar of the medieval period? Well, in part, it's one of my personal actions aimed at eroding silos. I don't just study leadership and change in organizations and software development. I read political theory and I read history. I particularly like medieval European history because it's a period that people look at as in between. For the most part, the medieval period is presented as the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of misery from the fall of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance. Although actually only the Western Empire fell, and it really didn't fall, it sort of petered out. The Eastern Empire persisted for another 1,000 years. But the medieval period has its own logic and its own patterns. And it is hugely interesting in terms of looking at what emerges, what goes from. The echoes of the Roman Empire are all throughout there. So what emerges when the Roman taxation system that funded a standing army broke down? What emerges when the basis of state power becomes gifting land instead of taxation? Or when people outside the elite 10% learn how to read? What emerges when there's a surplus of goods for trades? How does the presence or absence of paved roads affect trade patterns and political developments? Now, I'm not going to talk about those very interesting questions, at least they're interesting to me. What I am going to talk about is learning to look from the perspective of goes from, because it's extremely useful in understanding organizations and in creating conditions from which we can instigate change. Because our current organizational structures, including their silos, emerged from what came before. So profit-making corporations date back to the 17th century. The East India Company is one. It aimed at extracting wealth from the colonies. In the 18th century, we had industrialization, which emerged because of a confluence of conditions and changed organizations. Again, humans worked in service to great machines that produced cloth and other goods. And then in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Frederick Taylor influenced specialization. In 1913, Henry Ford introduced the assembly line, an idea that emerged from the desire to satisfy increasing demand for cars and influenced ideas about standardizing tasks. Now, from an industrial perspective, from an efficiency perspective, specialization makes a ton of sense. For example, rather than having one massively skilled person who could assemble a whole car, you have a bunch of lower skilled people working on one specific task or a series of related tasks. Now, obviously, assembling a car will go much faster with many people working on separate tasks than one person who has all the skills. Building the whole thing will take a long time. And with some tasks, you can do that, even something as complicated as a car. Of course, there's a downside to this, which is deconstructing jobs this way. It leads to boredom and stress and disengagement. But for the most part, you and I are not assembling cars. Some of you may be writing software for cars, but we're not assembling them. Yet as specialization became the norm, the tendency to break tasks down to their atomic level persisted and has crossed from manufacturing into administrative work and other kinds of work, like our kind of work. However, once everything's broken down, you have to deal with coordination. So once jobs get defined in this tiny way, they get grouped by tasks, that becomes a job. And then people with similar jobs get grouped together to coordinate their efforts. More people are more specialized and they include support activities. So jobs get grouped together often by a function, such as finance or manufacturing, HR, purchasing, R&D. And this grouping, as a result of this grouping, people tend to focus on their part. People with similar jobs clustered together, working on one aspect of the whole, but often not grasping the entire whole. And that was often a purposeful choice, which comes from the notion that workers should focus on their tasks and leave the thinking about the big picture to people with bigger salaries. Now, we tend to think of people as specialists as people with deep skills, but sometimes they're also very narrow skills based on a reductionist approach to work and to the world. And there you have silos. They came from these various factors. I don't think anyone set out to design silos. They emerged from a rational perspective and the need to coordinate, a desire for efficiency. But in our complex world, silos aren't so efficient. And yet we can't just smash them down. We need to look at what holds them in place and what value they might bring, what value specialization still provides. So if we want to change things, we need to look at what reinforces them. Professional identity tends to align with function or department. I mean, people often talk about what they do as who they are. Like, I'm an accountant, I'm a UX researcher, I'm a consultant, I'm a manager, I'm a developer or a tester. So silos reflect differences and identity reinforces them. Another thing that reinforces is that most organizations are governed vertically via chain of command, which was an idea introduced by Henri Fayol with all good intentions. And what it really does is it reinforces looking up and down rather than looking across or looking to the customer, which also reinforces silos. People who pay attention to their boss and their boss's boss, and bosses pay attention to those who report to them, and those may be another layer down. So it's looking up and looking down, focusing up, focusing down, not across. So reporting relationships are vertical, even though work takes place horizontally. Think about value change, which cross departmental boundaries, or graphs, the webs of relationships and networks that cross organizational boundaries, and how a lot of work and change really happens. Meanwhile, in the greater system, in society, expectations about people have for their kids have changed, expectations for admissions officers have changed, expectations of hiring managers have changed. See, everything touches everything in a society, so the forms of our organizations have influenced other aspects of society. The ideas that influenced the emergence of specialization in organizations are now influencing specialization in education and hiring, reinforcing silos. So when I started as a programmer, it was really, really rare to meet someone with a computer science degree, which isn't so surprising since computer science undergraduate degree programs really weren't common until after the late 60s. And even then, computer science was often regarded as a graduate level specialization. So the first computer science graduates with baccalaureate degrees would have been getting out of college around the time I started programming, which gives you another clue as to when I started and what language I might like. So there were a lot of people who had been programming for years, but for the most part, they came from some other sort of work or educational background. I worked with programmers who had been police officers or air traffic controllers or musicians or teachers. There were math majors, English majors, philosophy majors. I was an art history major, but almost everyone had studied some other field or done some really different kind of work before they came to programming. So people could talk about different things. They had kind of a broader view than just computer science. Not that people with computer science degrees can't talk about, lots of things, but, their focus educationally has been narrower, right? So it's becoming much less common to run into people who have a background outside of computer science, software engineering. Even though boot camps are beginning to open up programming to people who don't have those sorts of degrees, it seems like a lot of people these days are going to boot camp to start their career, not as a second or third career. So narrowing again, more specialization. This is exacerbating the problem of specialization and devaluing generalists who can span silos and bring different approaches. So a few years back, I was on a panel at a community college, and this was for people who were retraining to be network admins. One of the other people on the panel kept insisting that the only jobs they were qualified for were the most junior entry-level positions. So I asked people in the audience to share what they'd done before they entered into this retraining program. And there was a huge variety. There was a guy who had managed a grocery store, so he knew a lot about managing people. And he knew a lot about managing inventory. And even if he might not have known the terms, he probably understood queuing. He knew about dealing with customers and responding to their needs. Another had been a teacher, and she knew about managing group dynamics. She had been managing the flow of conversation and the interactions between groups of 20 to 25 people for years. She knew about the process of learning. Another had designed precision parts and knew about understanding requirements and manufacturing and statistical process control. So many of these people had super interesting backgrounds that seemed to me like they would be very valuable for someone working in an organization where you need to solve problems. They had a breadth of approaches. They had a lot of background that would help them solve all sorts of problems. But these reservoirs of knowledge and experience likely got overlooked because they were beginners in a specialty. And some hiring managers probably just focused on the ability to perform specific narrow tasks rather than the ability to solve broader problems. This is really short-sighted, reinforces silos. It emphasizes specializing early. Somehow, because these folks hadn't started out in network engineering, they were judged to be behind. They had to start over and gather experience from zero, even though their previous experience was hugely useful. They had different problem-solving approaches and lots of what I call white space skills. The stuff that may not show up on a job description, but it's really essential to functioning well on a team or in a group. Really useful if you're going to become a manager. So this isn't just happening in computer science. People are pushed into specialization earlier and earlier. It happens in high schools and universities, sports, music, choosing a future profession. And this leaves people little time to explore and sample and gain those skills that help them span silos. I mean, there's even talk, and in some places action, about shifting the goal of university education. This came up in my neighboring state, that they wanted to change the focus from meeting workforce needs instead of, searching for truth and becoming better citizens. So it is, as colleges and universities move in this way, it's going to become more and more difficult to break down silos. It's just going to become more difficult. So I'd like to have a little discussion at this point, because I've covered a fair amount of material here about how silos came to be. So I have a discussion question I'd like you to think about. We're going to go into breakout rooms. And the question is, how do you see silos being reinforced in your company? How do you see those silos being reinforced? And what impacts do you see in your company? So that's the question. We're going to do breakout rooms for 7 minutes. And when we come back, I won't be able to hear from all the groups, but I'm going to ask people if they want to share something to raise their hand using the reactions function in Zoom. And then we'll have a little conversation about specialization and what reinforces specialization. Okay, so I'm going to do the big reveal. My favorite language was assembler. We're not probably going to be able to hear from all the groups, but I'd like to hear from at least a few groups. So if you want to share something about your discussion about how silos are perpetuated and how they impact your organization, use the reaction function. It's in the bar at the bottom of your screen to put your hand up, and we'll call on a handful of people to share their insights. Okay, I see one hand up or a thumb up, or was that? Is the thumb up a yes, or is it you want to talk? I see Chris Burns. Pardon?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Sorry, is that Andy Brown? Yeah, I meant to put a hand up rather than the thumb up, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll put it down to fat thumb syndrome. Yep. Yeah, so what we thought in our group was that perhaps very often there's a desire by the organization that we're working for to actually expand us. It's often stated there, and to have us more rounded. But very often the urgency of a situation or the risk of a situation, I work for a consultancy, that they don't want to put someone into a client that hasn't already done that technology. So you end up in a circular situation there. And we felt, and the fallout from that, or the consequence of that, was higher attrition.
Yep.
So, yep.
Yeah, because people don't have a chance to develop new skills. And after a while, many people want to, not everybody. So Chris Burns.
Hello. So I reflected that specialisms can often breed a certain set of beliefs around sort of what's important. So you might have some sysadmins who they care about that uptime, they care about that rock solid reliability. And sometimes that's at the expense of being able to be dynamic towards customer need and that other concerns. But that self-identity and that set of beliefs can become a sort of tribe in itself, and that can often perpetuate those silos, because it almost feels like, well, nobody else cares about the thing that I care about, so I still need to care about it, otherwise it'll be forgotten. And that can sometimes perpetuate that.
Yeah, so you get the specialization and you get identity and you get the organizational container all kind of working together, and it just reinforces that view. And it is important to advocate those particular priorities, but you don't have to be a specialist to do it. You know, if you have that specialization, but you have some near neighbor skills, you can still advocate a point of view, but you're more likely to understand other people's points of view and other people's priorities. But yeah, under pressure, people often do that. In my experience, when a company is focused on, you know, over like 80% utilization, which most companies are, the chance for people to learn new stuff, to improve the way they work, or to learn, you know, to do any kind of cross skilling or broadening their skills, it really goes down. So that pressure also holds those silos in place. So Michael, what would you like to add?
Hi. Well, in our group, we sort of run out of time a little bit, really, but we touched on two different kinds of siloing. I put my hand up because I wasn't sure whether there was a particular type that you were after us to talk about, but we talked about the idea of specialization in skills, and needing quite specific things for specific technology means that we're, you know, when in my organization, we're often asking for people to have very, very specific skills and experts in one particular area. So it's hard for them to be experts in a lot of things. And if they are, they tend to end up sort of being team leaders and various other kinds of managerial roles because they can spread themselves across different skills. And then the other thing was that, well, actually in one of the other organizations that we discussed, it was kind of more of a structural thing where teams were doing everything differently. And it evolved ways that were called siloing, where communication between them wasn't really happening very well, and they were all working in different ways. So I wondered, that's quite clearly a sort of more structural thing. I wondered what your thoughts on those different types of siloing were.
Yeah, so it's a similar situation where there's a container that has become sort of impervious, right? And the exchanges between other groups have really been diminished, or there's not enough shared language for people to talk about. So I think that is a similar phenomena that's not as tightly tied to specialization, unless that team does really specialized things. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have specialists, right? There are certain problems where specialists are absolutely needed. And as you are pointing out, it can be hard for them to have deep skills in everything. And I don't think that's actually what's called for. What's called for is people to have, you know, they used to call it being a specialized generalist or a generalizing specialist, where you may have very deep skills in one thing, but you have, you know, okay skills in another thing, which enables you to talk more effectively to other people. And even if you've kind of done this in a serial fashion, you still have those other problem solving approaches from, you know, whatever field of study came before. So do we have time to hear from two more? Yeah, let's hear from Simon and then Mary Ellen, and then I'm gonna talk about things we can do. So Simon.
Hello. What was interesting, what we ended up talking about was that actually from our group said we like being specialists, and of course one of the problems that certain aspects can put pressure on the specialists that makes them even feel more siloed or jumping back into their silo is that something like, say, Scrum, where we're bringing everything to the party, you know, bring your whole self and help solve the things. Well, some people might not be that comfortable with that element. So sure. we ended up coming to the conclusion that perhaps, are we doing enough to really understand the individuals in the scenario, and saying, well, what do they love? What do they loathe? What do they like? And then perhaps understanding that on a deeper level, so that we bring people together for the right tasks or for the right work. So I was just interested on your views, and whether it's more not just the technical aspects of what people can do, but actually, do we need to consider a little bit more about what they actually like to do and whether they're introverted or extroverted, etc.
Yeah, well, for one thing, I want to say again, I'm not against specialization. I'm against a specialization when it is in a very narrow way that is de-skilling, right? Which, if you look at assembly line work, in some ways it's a very de-skilling. Specialists are needed for certain types of problems, absolutely, right? And I think we always have to look at both, what the job requires and what the person wants out of a job, because only when those two things match up is it going to be a good situation where somebody's likely to, bring their engagement and their creativity to the situation and stay, right? When people aren't getting what they want out of a job, it's easy for them to leave. So yeah, I think we do have to consider those, both as people in jobs and people hiring for jobs. We have to look at, what does this person want out of it? And sometimes they're, it's not a good fit, but it's an important question to ask for sure. Absolutely, for sure.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So Mary Ellen, and then I'm going to forge ahead.
Okay. Thanks for the alternative perspective, Simon. But anyway, in our group, we kind of focused on three different themes or three different things that we saw being that were enforcing silos that were maybe detrimental. One was management. I manage the developers, I manage the business analysts, and this is their job, and they can't go outside that, and they must deliver this, and nobody else must deliver it. Another one was about people hiring friends, and those friends being of like mind and background, like mind, maybe even look like the same background and whatnot. And then somebody mentioned that, which is along a similar vein, that their company has a boot camp, and they just realized through your conversation that everyone in that boot camp was under 25, so they weren't really bringing in kind of a diverse set of skills and perspectives and experience and that sort of thing. So
they're bringing in some experience that may be super useful, but it's perhaps not very diverse. Your comments made me think about an article I read recently about cognitive diversity, and how in many companies they make an effort to have some level of diversity. So they make sure that they're looking at gender or sexual orientation or race or ethnicity, but they all went to the same college, or they all went to the same university or little cluster of universities. So they all have the same patterns of thought, even though they might have different life experiences. So yeah, that can really reinforce, all sorts of patterns of thought. And that's one of the things we want to get away from with siloing, is we want to increase the cross-pollination and increase the possibilities for innovation and novel solutions to problems. So I'm going to shift now to what we can do to help something else emerge. What can we do that might create the conditions for something to come from? We have to start from where we are. We're going from, though we might have some idea about where we want to go towards. We are still going from. So let me share an analogy that I find sometimes helps people. So in ecology, the process through which you take rocky ground and it becomes a forest is referred to as forest succession. And I'm married to an ecologist, so I hear a lot about these things. And, as I was looking at forests and, he's talking about this, it occurred to me that this really is helpful in how we think about change in organizations. We look at how forests come to be just like historical developments, just like organizations, they don't like decide they're going to be a forest. They emerge from whatever exists. So when the conditions are right, you'll get a forest. Just like silos emerge when the conditions were right for silos. And in organizations and forests, there are lots of stages, each of which becomes possible because of an alteration in the environment, which itself alters the environment in some way, making the next stage possible, making that confluence of influencers that make it possible. So whatever you plant in a forest will affect the environment. Perhaps it loosens the soil, or it deposits nitrogen, or removes other nutrients. In nature, grasses and weeds are often the first to start on rocky ground, and they hold a little moisture in the soil, which makes it possible for another plant community. And those plants may create a little bit of shade, which will affect the humidity, and the shade will encourage some different plants, but discourage others. So, and eventually you get larger plants and eventually trees, and the trees create shade, which causes the sun-loving plants to die off. And like history, this rocky ground does not set out to become, it goes from where it was. So these things blend and overlap, and one state begins to emerge and the other fades. You can see the changes early if you pay attention, but you might not notice it until the progression is well underway, because it happens slowly and in small ways. So in nature, this can take decades, but horticulturalists and ecologists speed it up by studying the soil, the nutrient level, water levels, air, temperature, rainfall, all of that stuff. And then they ameliorate those things, and they choose plants that can thrive and survive the way it is now, knowing that whatever they do, it's going to make a change. And with diligent care, you can establish a forest within a few years. I mean, we actually did this with a prairie in my backyard, and in 50 years, if the person who owns the house now doesn't mess with it, it may be a forest, who knows? But we started that succession process. And this is the sort of thinking we have to apply to break down silos. We have to create the conditions for something else to emerge, something that's, a more holistic collaboration. So here are some ideas about how we can help something else emerge. One, look at your hiring and promotion practices and value and encourage later specialization. People who have wandering career paths often get shortchanged in the hiring process because it looks like, oh, you weren't serious. You did this and then you did that, and you did not specialize early. But that straight line may indicate that someone only has one set of problem-solving approaches. So broader experience, having sampled a bunch of different disciplines and career paths, can result in a broader repertoire when it comes to solving problems. Now, this matters a lot when it comes to solving wicked problems, the sort of problems that we encounter in the wild and complex domains. Now, in kind domains, what they call kind domains, patterns and problems repeat over and over, and feedback tends to be accurate and rapid. And this is where specialized expertise is super valuable, and it wins the day. But in these wicked sorts of situations, having multiple problem solving approaches and having seen a bunch of different patterns, not just from one particular specialty, comes in really handy, because you may recognize the sort of problem you're facing from another context. You may see patterns of what's contributing to it that remind you of another context. And so you just have this broader ability to recognize problems and approach them. And people who have sampled different disciplines have an advantage there, right? Because they've been exposed to multiple problem-solving approaches. And they can reason by analogy between contexts. So the second thing you can do while you're at it is look at your job descriptions. Are they narrow or are they broad? Do they emphasize technical skills, or do they include collaboration skills and the ability to work with people from different disciplines? If they are, you might try to fix them, which in many organizations takes an act of God and 17 vice presidents. But in the meanwhile, you can mentally modify them while you're recruiting. Third, you can actively encourage people to broaden, not just deepen their skills, and look at your promotion paths. Do they reward deepening expertise or developing breadth? As I said, both are valuable in different circumstances. Most companies need both, but in most companies, depth is valued over breadth. So, if you're in a situation where you're going to have problems that tend to repeat, favoring depth is fine. But if you have those sort of wicked problems, put some incentives in place to develop breadth. And if you have to look at both kinds of problems, look at both kinds of people. Fourth, you can incentivize a bit of career wandering within your company. Some companies rotate people through different parts of the business as part of their leadership development. I would actually advocate that for people at all levels of the company, not just leadership development. Learn something about your domain. If you're an accountant, go work with the testers. You'll learn something about accounting. You'll learn something about testing. They'll learn something about accounting. I mean, you can do a lot of things that foster cross-learning. Those are useful things to do. I mean, a lot of companies will send people to go work, developers to go work in customer support, so that they learn something about that job. They learn something about how people respond to their software. This is really valuable in terms of sampling. It increases domain knowledge. It adds to problem-solving approaches in many cases, and it also builds role empathy, which is so useful when you want to collaborate, right? Because you have some empathy for the other person's role. It develops a shared language. And that's an essential part of building silos, bridging silos, rather. I mean, somebody mentioned that about teams that could barely talk to each other. So having that shared language helps bridge that. Glenda Oyang, who's worth looking up, I'll put her contact in, or her reference in the chat. She talks about containers, differences, and exchanges as a way to influence patterns in organizations. Now, containers are anything that holds focus. It can be physical, like a geographic location, psychological, like identity, which we talked about, or organizational, like a silo. So differences are just that. And exchanges are the way information, value, and energy flows between and within containers. But containers are malleable. You can strengthen or weaken them. You can enlarge them. You can make them smaller. You can focus attention on value streams rather than functional groups or departments. You can weaken that container while increasing exchanges between containers and diminishing differences. Everything touches everything. And as people learn more about other professional concerns and focus on a customer rather than focusing on a functional goal, you get more collaboration and innovation. And you can build on that by focusing on top-line goals, not functional goals. Because functional goals reinforce silos and work against collaboration. They encourage competition. And I suspect we've all seen this. We've all seen this in various ways. Marketing is judged by one goal, product is judged by another. And that leads to a lack of collaboration. It leads to competition, and it can get in the way of delivering something great. So there's something to be said for reconciling these competing goals, at least from an intellectual and theoretical standpoint. But in reality, what happens is the people who end up having to do that are the ones with the least context and the least influence, left to hash it out. So raise them up a level. Focus on those other goals rather than focusing on functional goals. Just always make sure, what problem are we solving? What are we looking at here? So who has some ideas about what they can do from where they stand to move from silos to something different? Who has some ideas? Let's just put them in the chat. I don't think we have time to do another breakout, so let's have
No,
just some quick
unfortunately
things
we
in the
don't.
chat. So if you have any ideas, what can we do? Here we go. OKRs can help. Yeah, although they can also be very narrowly focused. So you have to make sure they are clearly tied to a top line goal. Tell me about Fedex Days. I don't know what Fedex Days are. Job swap days, communities of practice. Yeah, journey lines.
Ronnie, feel free to unmute to explain about Fedex Days quickly, please.
It's something done by Atlassian. It's basically people across the company work together for 2 days a week. So 2 days a week, sorry, 2 days in a session. It's all about that 48-hour delivery, hence FedEx. And basically, it's a small delivery team, but it's cross functionality. So it's like a member of HR might work with the developer because they've got an idea about something they could do from a HR point of view, or accountants might need a little bit of software, but they don't know about how to develop it themselves, so they work with the developer. It's about kind of the company, people across the company coming up with an idea and sharing it. Always focused sort of towards the company ideally, but yeah. Sort of hack days, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so hack days, hackathons are in some ways similar, but yeah, these are great ideas. And these are things you can often do without permission. You don't have to go out and, ask 100 people for permission to do this. A lot of these things you can do without really, asking, without getting a budget, without anything. You just do them. And if enough people do them, it will start to influence the silos. It will build out your network and influence it. Yeah, these are great ideas. So all of these can influence silos, communities of practice. Yeah. Yeah. These are great ideas. So if you're in a position of authority in an organization, there are certain things you can do. You can formalize some of these programs. I actually don't advocate just like getting rid of the silos. I think that level of disruption is often counterproductive. I think you just, you go at this like you're building a forest. The echo of the silo may still be there, but it will be a faint echo as you really begin to create the conditions for something else to emerge. And I really believe that, if we take this approach, if we look at it as going from, we can change this, whether we're working at the organizational level or the team level. You start where you are. And I believe we can create the conditions or contribute to the conditions for greater collaboration